I'd like to go back to the example of China that we used at the beginning of this presentation. China did not join the war. China did not choose a side. China asked Iran to let oil pass through. China's interest was China's economy. China's interest was not China's bravado. China's interest was not China's geopolitical standing. China's interest was not China's ego on the international market or the international political scene. China's interest was China's economy. Get us the oil. So at this point, I really like to talk to the minds and hearts of African policymakers. It is true we are a people with pride and dignity. At the same time, pride and dignity do not feed the people. Most of our problems in Africa are down to the fact that we do not have an industrialized base. Without an industrialized base, there is no economy, and without an economy, there are no jobs. Hey, you're all welcome to the Beyond Africa podcast. And today we're having some reflection about what is happening in the Middle East, Africa's opportunities, and what we can learn from these countries in the Middle East that are in conflict. First of all, the conflict has been ongoing for about 6 days or 1 week now. And we saw America's direct intervention on Saturday, where President Trump ordered the American military to go destroy the nuclear facilities where Iran is said to have been enriching uranium to produce nuclear weapons. But that is not the focus of our conversation. I want us to reflect on what Africa as a continent, as a people, stand to learn from Israel and from Iran. This is because they are where they are because they have produced value. They have enriched what they have. They're in conflict because Israel feels that if Iran develops a nuclear weapon, they are at risk. Now, the nuclear weapon that Israel has and that Iran wants to develop is a product of the country's investments. It's a product of what the country has put together as investments, as priorities. Uranium on its own is bare minerals. We have enough of that in Africa, but we have not reached a level where we can use it for anything. Besides using uranium for military purposes as a nuclear weapon, uranium is one of the best sources of nuclear energy. And we have an energy problem in Africa. We have not been able to develop our nuclear energy from uranium to power our industries in Africa. And that is what I want us to think about here. What should we, as Africa, be learning from Israel and from Iran? How did they get to this point? They got to this point because they have the capacity, the interest, the policy, and the ability to develop what they have. All of us know Africa is very rich in natural resources, but why do we not develop these resources up to that point? We'll look at that. Before I get to that, let me go on to the current news. Iran actually retaliated today by firing missiles into Qatar and targeting United States military bases in Qatar. That apparently did not yield any positive results. But there is this de-escalation right now. President Trump has just put out this post where he congratulates everyone. And he says it has been fully agreed by and between Israel and Iran that there will be a complete and total ceasefire. What is next? Are we going to continue witnessing negotiations between Iran and Israel with the intervention of the United States? But one other thing that I would like us to reflect about is China's interest. When I go through social media and listen to most analysts of African origin talking about this conflict and look at it from the geostrategic point of view, which is very relevant for the growth of Africa, one thing I note is some people who are so Pan-Africanist, who want to see Africa develop and have all these nuclear weapons of their own, they're calling on China and other BRICS countries to intervene and support Iran. And I think there is a fundamental lesson here on what we're going to be discussing about what we should be learning from Iran and from Israel. China has not intervened in the conflict. China has not shown any interest in intervening in the conflict. And what we have seen so far are news reports that China issues warning to Iran after Iran threatens to close the Strait of Hormuz. And the Strait of Hormuz is in the Persian Gulf, runs through Iran, and Iran controls that strait. That is, ships carrying petroleum pass through that side of the world, and they go into China. And China's interest here is Iran, do not close that strait. We need that oil because oil runs our economy. So I want us to think again here. Now, the main point here is China is interested in building its economy. What are we as Africans, as African analysts, interested in? Are we interested in power, or are we interested in building our economy? I want us to look a little bit at what happens or what pertains in Israel and Iran on certain levels of what could be of importance to Africa, so we could learn from there and copy what could help our continent advance. Number one is education. So literacy rates in Iran rose to 90% by 2020, reflecting huge investments in education. And Iran is ranked about the 15th in academic and education production, with more than 50,000 scientific papers, academic papers in academic journals published annually. In Israel, about 49% of adults hold tertiary degrees, and they're among the highest around the world. And Israel spends about 6.1% of its GDP on education, producing about 12,000 graduates in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. So you then see how Israel moves towards more of science, more of technological innovation, and why they could afford or produce nuclear weapons. What lesson is in this for Africa? Africa needs to prioritize accessible and quality education and build human capital. This is very important. Let's look particularly at what Israel does. The science, technology, engineering, and mathematics drive that has focused on their development. I think I'll come back to talk about this in a different episode where I'll focus uniquely on why Israel became the giant of the Middle East. I'm reading a book called The Startup Nation. That book is wonderful. It traces how Israel got to where they are. Second element, diaspora engagement. Let us talk about the diaspora engagement. About 5 million Iranians are living in the diaspora. And of this, 1.5 million are in the United States and Canada. And they send back remittances, that is money back to the country, of about 1.5 billion US dollars. And they contribute enormously into the tech and science development back in the continent. In Israel, about 7 million Jews are in the Israeli diaspora with very strong ties back to the country. One peculiarity, which is a difference between Israel and other countries, is Israel brings and pulls their diaspora back to support them. That is why in the United States, the Israeli diaspora is very strong and it contributes to American foreign policy, even American domestic policy in a very significant way, because they're hugely and significantly organized. So diaspora investments and advocacy actually make Israel's economy grow and influence geopolitical strategy around the world, contributing about 2 billion yearly in direct support back to the continent. So what lesson is in this for Africa? Africa just needs to leverage its diaspora. Africa has a significant diaspora, a diaspora that is hugely embedded in technology, in science, innovation, business, in fact, all fields that you can find out here. But most African governments have not yet created the environment for the African diaspora to contribute to African development. So it is important that the African diaspora itself structures itself in a way that it can contribute to development back home. Then we talk about technology and innovation. Iran ranks as the 62nd country on the Global Innovation Index with more than 2,000 tech startups, and 7% of the GDP is spent on research and development. Missile and drone technology advancements also demonstrate self-reliance, producing about 750 to 1,000 ballistic missiles before 2025. Israel ranks 5th in the Global Innovation Index, with 9,000 tech startups and 5% of GDP on research and development. Israel is home to more than 100 multinational research and development centers, and Israel files 1,500 patents annually. And also, they are leading in cybersecurity and AI. Like I said, we're going to have another episode where we're talking about Israel and how Israel got to where they are. When I heard the story of Israel, I was talking with partners at the Israel Africa Institute, and I was amazed to learn more about technology and development in Israel. I think it opened my eyes to think more about how the African diaspora can contribute back to the continent. But first of all, the policies must be made at home for the diaspora to contribute, because that is actually what brought Israel to the limelight. So what lessons do we have from here? In African governments just have to invest in research and technology and build an ecosystem where multinational companies can actually create incubators on the continent. This is actually very important, and this comes along with legal frameworks, policy setups to encourage research and development, where foreign companies, foreign tech companies would create their incubators back in Africa, and they would actually like that. The next, agriculture and food security. Iran has prioritized agricultural cooperation, notably with countries like Kenya, Uganda, and Zimbabwe. In 2023, Iran signed deals to establish drone centers in Uganda and for agriculture and military use, enhancing crop monitoring and productivity. Bilateral trade with Kenya, Iran's second largest African partner, includes about $50 million of tea exports. As for Israel, Israel invests heavily in agricultural technology, exporting drip irrigation and seed enhancement systems to over 20 countries. In 2017, Israel launched a $100 million agricultural program in Uganda, boosting yields by 30% in pilot centers. Israeli firms like Netafirm operate in Ethiopia, Kenya, and South Africa with about 200 million in annual exports. So the lesson here for Africa is both nations, that is Israel and Iran, actually want to invest in Africa. While Iran is just starting, Israel has actually invested in Africa over time, and its investments in the agricultural sector are actually yielding. So let's look at infrastructure and construction. Let us look at infrastructure and construction, how Iran and Israel have related with Africa. Iran has proposed infrastructure projects in Senegal, including roads, railway, ports, and airport construction, which could be valued at about 100 million, that's since 2010. In 2023, Iran offered technical expertise for Burkina Faso's urban development, though projects remain very young due to sanctions and limiting funds. How has Israel fared in Africa? Africa-Israel Investment Limited, founded in 1934, focuses on real estate and infrastructure with projects in Nigeria and South Africa. So let's look at energy resources. Iran has pursued energy deals supplying Kenya with 4 million metric tons of crude oil annually since 2009. And in 2004, Niger opened an embassy in Tehran to negotiate uranium exports, raising US concerns. Uranium, as you know, is the main mineral that produces nuclear weapons. Iran's trade in petroleum and chemicals with South Africa reached 200 million in 2022. Israel has invested in mining, with mining magnate Dan Gelter holding about 2 billion in assets in the Democratic Republic of Congo and in Guinea. Israel also supplies natural gas to Egypt, indirectly supporting the African energy market, with exports valued at 500 million annually. What lesson is there for Africa? Iran's energy deals offer diversification, but sanctions pose risk. Israel's resource investments highlights the need for transparent contracts to ensure local benefits. What lesson is in here for Africa? Africa needs to bring in investors and encourage investors to transform these resources on the continent. Uranium, as mentioned earlier, is a very good source for civilian energy, which is cheap and affordable. And we know that African countries lack energy. That is why we are suffering from lack of industrialization. We can have all the plans to industrialize, but if we don't have sources of energy, we're not going to industrialize. So African governments and African peoples should start thinking about getting foreign companies to transform those resources on the continent and encourage industrialization. This comes with a policy and legal framework that favors industrialization, favors investment, and favors capitalization. So let's talk about trade and diplomacy. Iran's 2023 Africa tour by President Raisi strengthened trade ties with Kenya, Uganda, and Zimbabwe, aiming for a 1 billion in total trade by 2025. The Iran-Africa Cooperation Summit of 2024 attracted 30 African delegations focusing on technology and security. As for Israel, Israeli exports to Africa reached 1.6 billion. Over 40 countries maintain diplomatic ties with Israel as of 2025, with trade agreements in cybersecurity and health tech, notably with Morocco that recently signed a contract of 300 million. What lesson is in here for Africa? Iran's diplomatic push counters Western dominance, while Israel's trade leverages tech expertise. African nations could use these rivalries to secure favorable terms, prioritizing local industrialization, as seen in Morocco. So both countries bring in different interests, and it is in the interest of the African nations to choose what is to their benefit. I'd like to go back to the example of China that we used at the beginning of this presentation. China did not join the war. China did not choose a side. China asked Iran to let oil pass through. China's interest was China's economy. China's interest was not China's bravado. China's interest was not China's geopolitical standing. China's interest was not China's ego on the international market or the international political scene. China's interest was China's economy. Get us the oil. So at this point, I really like to talk to the minds and hearts of African policymakers. It is true we are a people with pride and dignity. At the same time, pride and dignity do not feed the people. Most of our problems in Africa are down to the fact that we do not have an industrialized base. Without an industrialized base, there is no economy, and without an economy, there are no jobs. And without jobs, there is no income for individuals. So we need to build an industrialized economy to create jobs. This must only come about if we prioritize investments on the continent. We cannot continue talking geopolitics and politics all the time over practicality. We need to create a free system where people can actually invest, make money, and we benefit. We cannot prioritize making more rules that keep investments out in a system where we don't yet have investments. We need to do that. And I would like to close with this announcement of an Israeli company that is investing in Africa around the Lobito Corridor. For those who don't know the Lobito Corridor, I'll do a presentation about it sometime in the future. It's an investment track that runs across the continent, and it's not to Africa's advantage. It is to foreign advantage. It is to Western advantage, unfortunately. But how do we take advantage of that? We'll need to talk about that in the future. I came across this announcement on May 14, 2025. Haim Taib, the founder and president of the Meno, Medin, and Metrele Group, announced in partnership with the Angola Sovereign Fund the launch of a 1 billion Lobito Corridor Impact Development Platform. This landmark private initiative will fuel sustainable, inclusive development across Angola through the DRC and into Zambia through the Lobito Corridor. Its mission is to invest in catalytic projects across agriculture, infrastructure, healthcare, light industry, education, and digital inclusion that unlock economic value, empower local communities, and accelerate regional integration. This, in my view, is what Africa should be looking for. Africa should look at what can bring investments to the continent. We need investments on the continent. That is what is going to transform Africa. So from the battle between Israel and Iran on both sides, what are we looking for? My view is we should learn from them. If Israel and Iran are at loggerheads today because Israel has nuclear weapons and Iran doesn't have nuclear weapons, they have used their education, they have used their intellect, they have used their resources, they have leveraged the diaspora, they have leveraged foreign direct investment, and they have built this. We have the natural resources, but we need to transform them. If we do not transform our natural resources, we'll never be where we are. We can take sides all we want in the conflicts. We can support Israel, we can support Iran for whatever reason. But at the end of the day, what is the need for Africa? That is a question we should be asking. What are we doing to advance Africa's interest in the current geopolitical setting? I think that is what we should be thinking about. How can Africa benefit from this? Should Africans go fight for one of the countries? I say no. Should Africans send troops or money to one of these countries? I say no. Africa should look at what made them to be where they are today. And from there, Africa can also get there someday. The problem is not, I repeat, the problem is not who is right and who is wrong. To the African, the problem should be how did they get there and how can we get there? And that was Beyond Africa with me, Ngali Bernard. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you very much for watching this reflection. And as usual, we call on you to subscribe, like, and share. Also, leave a comment so we know what you think, how we performed, and what you would like us to talk about. It's always very refreshing reading your comments, exchanging within the comments section, because that is how we build a community, and we believe Africa is one community, and we're going to build that community in the comments section. See you next time.